All right, we're backing slowly out of the Modjeska Monteith Simkins House. Today, we're going to look primarily at the curatorial spaces, but there are education and meeting spaces as well. And if we have time at the end of this, I'll definitely share those with you. So with that, welcome to Modjeska Monteith Simkins, an advocate of the people. From 1932 until her death in 1992, Modjeska Monteith Simkins lived in this Columbia cottage-style home. It was built sometime between 1890 and 1895, and later it was purchased by Simkins herself at auction on July 4th. During those 60 years, this home served as the city's center for civil rights and social justice activities. Simkins was truly an advocate of the people. She was born here in Columbia, South Carolina, on December 5th, 1899, to Henry Clarence Monteith, a brick mason, and Rachel Hull Monteith, a school teacher. Her parents instilled really strong qualities of leadership, activism, and compassion and empathy in all of their children, as together they navigated the cruelties and injustices that define the Jim Crow period. Simkins ultimately carried these ideals throughout her life, as many of you know, fighting to improve the lives of all South Carolinians. So now, as we move to room 1, we begin with the theme and action of organize. This space is designed to draw readers fully inside. And as you can see, there's a lot happening. There's a lot happening in Simkins' early decades of organizing. But we hope that as visitors enter this room, they see that they're immediately confronted with this pair of quotes that truly describe the beginning of the Jim Crow era as it was understood by both Black and white South Carolinians. So I'm going to just read these to you. We did not disfranchise the Negroes until 1895. Then we had a constitutional convention convened, which took the matter up calmly, deliberately, and avowedly with the purpose of disfranchising as many of them as we could under the 14th and 15th Amendments. We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. This is, of course, former Governor Benjamin Tillman, as he is addressing his co-workers in the US Senate in 1900. And we juxtapose this with Simkins herself, reminding people decades later, during the reign of Ben Tillman, the Black people were totally disfranchised. So this is a technique that we really use throughout this exhibit. It's the first of many instances in which we juxtapose Simkins' recollections with those of her contemporaries, both Black and white. It's allowing us to show again and again that Simkins' achievements did not exist in a vacuum. She's literally making change in a world full of legal and social barriers that were erected primarily by white men like Benjamin Tillman. And these barriers are referenced in the intro panel that you can see on the right called Creating Jim Crow, but we're not actually going to get into that. Immediately underneath this, you'll see, and I should say the scrim images that you see across the windows are actually some of the oldest known of Simkins. These are of a young Modjeska Monteith at home on the family farm just outside of downtown Columbia that have been reproduced and actually are covering up windows in this space. But this whole side of the room is really about setting the stage for this early Jim Crow period in which Modjeska Monteith is growing up in. And the reader rail that's below the windows really, really punctuates this. So it's got 3 sections. The first one is called The Usual Fate. And this is actually taken from a title of a state newspaper article that is discussing a lynching, right? So this is one of the many instances in many ways that lynchings in white-owned newspapers appeared. It really shaped the mindset of the South that lynching as an act of violence was perhaps at sometimes deserved or unsurprising, but at all times it was made into a spectacle for both Black and white readers to read. The idea of media is very, very important to the Monteith family. Rachel Hull Monteith was an early member of the Niagara movement, which was a predecessor or forerunner to the National NAACP. And so she subscribed to The Voice, which was that monthly newsletter. And then she later subscribed to The Crisis, which was the national newsletter for the NAACP, because these were opportunities for the Monteith family to read Black news, as it's portrayed by Black writers. So every night, Rachel Hull Monteith is reading to her children these stories about really, really horrific acts of violence. And she's reading them from both Black and white newspapers. So the State, and then of course, as I mentioned, the Crisis magazine. And so this part of the panel really gets at this. And as you'll see, some of these titles that Modjeska Monteith is absorbing are things like Life for a Slap, Lynched for Running Gauntlet, and again, The Usual Fate. And all of these taken together helped normalize white on Black violence. So this is Simkins' upbringing in Columbia, South Carolina. On the far side of the reader rail, Chandler, if you could kind of zoom over, and we'll get to the middle in a second. You know, this was definitely the brainchild of DJ Polite. As I mentioned, he worked on this exhibit. We thought, because we focused so heavily on lynching, that we needed to give people an opportunity to hear their names. You know, there were nearly 200 victims in South Carolina alone, more than 4,000 across the United States that are known. And so this is actually an audio component, but Chandler's on mute right now. But we had members of the community come together and read the names and the counties and the dates of every individual that we know of that was lynched in South Carolina. So when people walk into this room, they actually hear those names coming from this reader rail. Then the center portion is one of many, many interactive exercises that we ask visitors to look at. And this one, again, is specifically looking at media and about lynching. And we juxtapose 3 newspapers that are all local. One is Black owned, the Palmetto Leader, which you'll see right there. I'm sorry, I know this is a little bit blurry. Then in the little panel pocket on the right-hand side, there are 2 other ones. But what I would ask is that you really look at the headline, right? This is the Palmetto Leader, founded by local Black attorney Nathaniel J. Frederick. You'll notice it's very, very clear that this is about a lynching, 3 lynched. This is in 1926 in Aiken, South Carolina. This was the Lohman family, Bertha, Clarence, and Demon Lohman. If you'll scroll a little bit to the right, please, Chandler. This is the same headline from the Columbia Record, which is a white-owned newspaper. And here you'll see the headline is not about the lynching that occurred that week. It's about the World Series. So we really, really ask leaders to think about a couple of things when they look at this reader rail. And one is, can you even find anything about the Lohman family? And 2, how is the family described? And what they'll see in the Palmetto Leader on the left-hand side is that Bertha Lohman, who was a young African-American woman, was referred to as a, quote, defenseless colored woman. And the Columbia Record in the state newspaper on the right-hand side refer to her and her sibling and cousin alternately as criminals, or similar to a similar effect, or not even using their names at all. And so this is, again, just an instance of, you know, by this time Simkins is in her 20s, and she's really thinking about the power of media and shaping how everyone thinks about current events, right? And it's great because in the 1920s, the African-American community in the Midlands at least had the Palmetto Leader, which was really focusing on a lot of issues. And in a few minutes, we're going to take a look at the newspaper that kind of takes up that mantle a couple of decades later as we move into the civil rights era. But now, Chandler, if you'll kind of zoom out and take a look at the floor. So y'all might have noticed that as Chandler walked into the space, he actually walked across this really, really giant floor map. And, you know, we call this Simkins Columbia in 1933. There are so many things about Simkins' life and about life for African-Americans in Columbia throughout this period that we could not fit into this exhibit. But what we thought would be useful, especially for high school and college students, is to take a step back and really look at some of these at some of these places that are really important to the African-American community, and also to really get a sense of just how segregated downtown Columbia was in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. So as students walk around and navigate this map, they'll see not only sites that are important to Modjeska Monteith Simkins, including the Simkins farm, including the motel that she later owned that was in the Green Book, but also places that aren't there anymore. So what you'll see on the far side, Chandler, if you'll walk towards that, are a couple of areas. The smaller red area is the Black Business District, where Simkins and her husband, Andrew Simkins, actually owned a building, which was where a newspaper that they helped fund was later located. And then you'll also see the really, really giant Ward 1 district. You know, this was a really important African-American district that has since been demolished almost completely and subsumed by the University of South Carolina. So we're kind of recalling these different areas that were important to the community and integrating it with different images of some of those businesses and moments. But the other two portions of this room, and as I said, the theme of this room is truly organized. So now we've taken Simkins through the 19-teens and 1920s, and we're looking at her as an adult. And there are two areas that we really decided to focus on. The first one is healthcare, and the second one is early legal battles of the NAACP and voting rights. But healthcare, Simkins was the first and only person to hold the position that was called the Director of Negro Work for the South Carolina Tuberculosis Association. Tuberculosis was a major problem, especially coming out of World War I. And South Carolina formed this association to try to combat it. But the truth is, they were only combating it for white individuals. And so they eventually brought Simkins on a recommendation to kind of go out into the community and start educating people about not just the dangers of tuberculosis, but also the kinds of treatments that were available and the kind of steps they could take to protect themselves. And so this is happening throughout the 1930s and the first couple of years of the 1940s. And Simkins is literally traveling across the state and meeting with these really rural and impoverished areas, and also trying to fundraise to pay for her own position and her own kind of programs. And every year in the South Carolina Tuberculosis Association annual report, she has 1 or 2 pages that they give to her to talk about just how bad things are in the African-American community, and also how she's attempting to fundraise from the people she's trying to help who don't have a lot of money. So Chandler, if you'll zoom in on that graph on the bottom half. And again, so we're looking at different things that, she's actually reporting in this. And this in particular really struck me, and I know it's blurry and hard for y'all to read, but this is a bar graph that Simkins herself created for the 1935 South Carolina Tuberculosis Association's annual report. And what you're seeing on there is the difference between whites and African Americans in 1935 as it relates to general health, disease, as well as tuberculosis. You'll note the left-hand columns are the white community, and the far left-hand column is actually the population distribution. So there are more white South Carolinians than Black South Carolinians. But on the other hand, on the far right, you'll notice at just what disproportionate effect African Americans are dying from tuberculosis. And that is because of a lack of access to healthcare, a lack of access to good nutrition, and just general access to information about how to, again, treat tuberculosis and also keep it from spreading. And, we came up with this almost 2 years ago, but it's never been more timely and more relevant than what we've seen in the last year with COVID. Chandler, if you'll zoom out and then to the right, just a tiny bit. And then of course we couldn't leave without talking about the Good Samaritan Waverly Hospital. Simkins was the chief fundraiser for the effort to build this hospital. And we look at the fact that she even had to fundraise for an effort to build a segregated hospital in the 1940s and 1950s. And, I won't ask Chandler to pull it out, but the bottom, little pamphlets that you see, this boxing burlesque in the Bible, was kind of a more fun take at some of the ideas Simkins had on how to fundraise. She brought the African-American community together at places like the Township Auditorium to view these really fun programs, which included this one burlesque program in which her husband dressed up, as did the owner of the Big Apple nightclub, as did Dr. C.A. Johnson, the head of Booker T. Washington High School and namesake of Johnson today. So there's kind of these fun PR releases and different things that you can see throughout the exhibit that kind of, again, brings in all the other players that are organizing in Columbia during this time period, which by now is the 40s and 50s. And then the final aspect that we look at in this room, and again, we're having to cover a lot of ground in Simkins' life, is of course the early legal battles of the South Carolina NAACP. So what we have here is, Simkins was a founding member of the South Carolina Conference of the NAACP, which is all of the different branches coming together. So just like her mother was a founding member of the Columbia branch decades earlier, Simkins is a founding member in '39 of the South Carolina Conference, which is again, bringing together all of these different branches. And then in 41, she is elected the state secretary of the South Carolina NAACP. She was really the corresponding secretary. So that means everything PR related, everything media related, all of the ideas about what we're going to say and how we're going to get the information to people is going through Simkins. And a lot of it is going through this house. So here we see an activist emerges and an influential voice. And these fights that we're looking at here are the fight for equal teacher pay in 1944, in which the NAACP is successful. And then more clearly, what Simkins notes in that quote at the top, which is, we must make our first fight for the vote. So as South Carolina is litigating this equal pay for African-American teachers, Smith v. Allwright is happening in Texas, which is the fight to end the all-white Democratic primary. And surprisingly, they're successful at the Supreme Court level. And so this becomes the fight in South Carolina as well. And that center panel, the influential voice, we pull a quote from Simkins about the fact that during this fight, that lasts throughout the late 1940s, Thurgood Marshall himself is coming and staying in this home and having jam sessions around her table and talking about legal strategy. And in that influential panel, we're also talking about the fact that Simkins was an early proponent, or even kind of the idea maker behind the idea of bringing what she called a fighting news organ, the Lighthouse and Informer newspaper, to Columbia, South Carolina, to really become the voice of the South Carolina NAACP. So at this point, the Palmetto Leader had become very much a society and church newspaper. And Black Columbians really needed, and not just Columbians, but really people across the state needed a newspaper that was telling them what was going on with the NAACP fight. And the Lighthouse and Informer was what did that. So Simkins convinced its editor, John H. McCrae, to come to Columbia. He was first set up in the Simkins building, which was on Washington Street in downtown Columbia. And she helped fund that newspaper for many years. And that's where these headlines are coming out. And they're very, very different than the ones that are coming out of the state newspaper and the Columbia Record. And so what we do on that far right panel, and you'll see there's a lot of little text on there, which is going to be very, very blurry because of our internet connection. But we look at this idea of the losing side, and again, you can't read these, but I know them pretty much by heart, but we're looking at from Smith v. Allwright in 1944, headlines all the way through the end of the all-white Democratic primary in 1948. And it's really interesting to read these headlines because, this is such an inspirational fight when we look back on it, but it was really, really, really not what white South Carolinians wanted. And that includes, of course, the all-white state legislature and the all-white Democratic Party. And so a lot of these headlines really focus on that angle, and it's coming at this fight from that perspective. So when we look at democracy winning at the end, we're celebratory, right? But the state newspaper wasn't necessarily that way. So August 10th, 1948, we say more than 1,000 Black citizens voted for the first time in the Waverly neighborhood at a pure oil gas station that has, of course, since been demolished. It's right where the Millwood expansion happened. And so that concludes, the end of Simkins and some of her the other organizers not being able to vote in this Democratic primary. But of course, the fight doesn't end there. And the national organization knows that. And the state organization knows that, but what might the franchise give them more than 4 decades after Ben Tillman and the South Carolina State Constitution took it away from them? And so as you leave this room, we look at a pamphlet from 1952 that was produced by the National Organization of the NAACP, and we see Black citizens demanded equality, and their votes were the key, right? So if you'll zoom in just a little bit, Chandler, you're looking at these giant keys that are trying to open doors that are restricted to African Americans, right? And this includes, most importantly, segregated housing, segregated travel accommodations, right? The need for the Green Book, a segregated military. And then on the upper right-hand corner, we'll look at your votes will open schools for all, right? This is the next major battle that's going to take place, which is the desegregation of schools. And with that, we ask that Chandler wander into the next space, which is called Resist. And for those of you that have seen the Simkins House, you'll wonder what has happened on this wall. This is actually a full-size scrim, which is kind of like a giant shade for a window. And the light that you see coming through that are actually the two windows that are on that side of the room. We're working with a very, very small house. And so we wanted to do everything we could to make sure that we utilized every space possible while not necessarily compromising to, keep the windows in play. And so, room 2 is organized around this theme of resist. And you'll see it's got giant quotes from different individuals, but I'm going to focus on this one. I know the battle is a tough one, but if we stick together, we can win. McKinley Carter, Detroit, Michigan, 1955. So what has happened between getting the right to vote in 1948 and 1955? What is this battle that is taking place? And as many of us know, the next fight is over the desegregation of schools. We have a landmark case here in Clarendon County, South Carolina, called Briggs v. Elliott. This is the next battle for people like Thurgood Marshall and Modjeska Simkins, is organizing these parents to petition first for bus transportation in 1947, but then slowly to move on to actually desegregating schools themselves and saying, were separate schools equal? Absolutely not. So we have to end separate but equal schools. And so we took care to try to look at this from a different perspective. If you'll zoom in on the middle panel, Chandler, these two photographs are actually used quite frequently. The white suburban-integrated school is on the left, and the African-American school, Liberty Hill Elementary, is on the right. You'll notice the very, very stark differences, right? You look at these two photos of school, of where elementary students in Clarendon County actually attended, and you can tell they're not equal, right? But how unequal were they, right? It's kind of a nebulous thing. You just know that they're not unequal. The petition that the parents signed in 1949 that was sent to the Clarendon County School Board mentions the facilities in particular and how unequal they were, and the fact that there wasn't bus transportation. And so we actually took a look at what schools reported to the South Carolina State Board of Education. And this is what you see. Far, far more African-American students than white in Clarendon County, South Carolina in 1950. But look at the building cost. They're spending literally thousands of times more on things like fuel, light, power. The African-American schools didn't have indoor plumbing, much less electricity. Repair and upkeep, white elementaries and white high schools, again, thousands of times more than the black elementaries, and $0 on the African-American high school in Clarendon County. And then if you'll scroll all the way to the bottom, buses, 31 district school buses for Clarendon County, South Carolina in 1950, and 0 for the African-American schools. So this is just how different things were during this fight. It works its way through the Supreme Court. It takes many years. Things are really, really bad for these Black petitioners. Many of them are fired almost immediately after signing that petition in 1949. Some of them have to leave the state because they feared violence or because they could not get a job absolutely anywhere and had to figure out a way to support their families. And you'll see many of them, that came together in that photograph on the top right-hand corner. And these are all of the petition signers. And I say all of the petition signers because that petition doesn't just have the parents' signatures, it has the children's as well. And lead petitioner is on the kind of the middle row, far left-hand side. That's Harry Briggs Sr. right there, and his son, Harry Briggs Jr., standing in front of him. So this is the namesake of the petition itself, Briggs v. Elliott. And Simkins is in this photograph as well. So ultimately, oh, there she is in the hat, and she's got very, very reflective glasses, which is a little unfortunate. So this was taken in, I believe, 1951. So that case, works its way up to the Supreme Court and becomes what is the landmark case of the 20th century, ruling separate but equal schools are unconstitutional. And you notice at the bottom that we said a landmark case ends in, quote, victory. Because of course, as that case works its way through the court, Governor Jimmy Burns is doing everything he can to, quote, equalize schools, which means building more African-American schools and kind of fixing up the ones that already exist and doing anything he can to make sure that desegregation doesn't happen. Just because the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional did not mean that schools were actually going to desegregate. And this is when we enter this period of what is known as massive resistance by the white population. And so that idea of resist that you saw on the wall is really twofold. We look throughout the rest of this room at that massive white resistance, but we also look at the resilience and resistance that Simkins and other kind of ordinary citizens and also, leadership in the NAACP are taking to fight back against that resistance. And so the centerpiece in this room, as the centerpiece in the last room was the map, is this mimeograph machine. Again, Simkins was the corresponding secretary for the South Carolina NAACP. That means everything that was coming out of that organization was created by her. It was created in this house, and she had to make photocopies somehow. So she had a mimeograph machine very, very similar to this, which makes a little over 100 copies. I think a minute. You just crank that little thing and it busts out copies. But she's also having to actually create the first copy. And so some of the language on these panels looks at how do you actually make a stencil to make a photocopy. It's not like today where you type it on a computer and print it out. So we look at that. And then we also look at some of the documents that she actually made and what that meant. So Chania, if you'll scroll down a little bit. The one we really looked at is the Stronger Together panel, looking at boycotts. And I want you to, Chandler, just to focus in on the document itself, and we'll see if we can get it kind of clear. Right, so one way that Simkins and others devised of fighting back against this massive white resistance was identifying people in businesses that were members of or supportive of what was known as the White Citizens Council, which again was just kind of average white citizens, quote unquote, coming together and trying to force African Americans to take their names off these school petitions and stop trying to desegregate schools. And remember, this is after the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education. So Simkins and others devised of this list of places in Orangeburg, South Carolina, where South Carolina State University is. And she typed it up on she typed it up on a typewriter, made copies of a mimeograph machine, cut them all up, and put them under windshields at South Carolina State football games. And it was telling people, look at this. If you want freedom, work for it. And she has little things to say about every single place. Coca-Cola, enough said, right? And it goes on and on and on. And so we have copies of this for students to look at, and the education staff has come up with some questions, not just why are boycotts effective, but additional questions. And those are actually in a little side panel around the right-hand side of this reader rail. So if the centerpiece of this room looks at local media or statewide media and how Simkins was leveraging that, then the far wall looks at national media and how Simkins was really, really effective at leveraging that. And again, I know it's a little blurry and a little hard to see, but we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about these letters. So again, after Brown v. Board of Education, this massive resistance campaign is going on. And there's also kind of a renewed, I guess, sense of violence and actual violent acts that are happening in the South. And, the most famous one is, of course, the murder of Emmett Till, which was reported nationally at first. And then people, especially white newspapers, really pulled back. And so that story was being really carried out by Jet magazine, which was a national Black-owned newspaper, kind of little newspaper, not a newspaper, but like a little magazine. And so in 1955, there are reporters reporting on that and the subsequent trial, but they're also reporting on what's happening in South Carolina and how citizens are continuing to sign petitions saying Clarendon County, Orangeburg County, Sumter County, we need to desegregate schools. And we're demanding, based on this recent ruling in Brown, that you need to desegregate schools. And they're still being punished, right? So these white citizens councils are happening. So these Black petition signers cannot get loans for farm equipment. They can't get loans for their businesses. They have lost a lot of business, or they're not able to buy anything for their business. And they're basically, under what Simkins referred to as pressure. And so Jet reporters came and stayed at her motel, which was up on Two Notch Road. And they were talking about what they could do to help these individuals in these counties. So they were already planning like a front page cover story about this. But what they decided to do collectively with Modjeska Simkins was put in this call to action at the end of this story about the farmers of Clarendon, Orangeburg, and Sumter counties. And it ran in the October 20th, 1955 issue of Jet magazine. And Chandler's going to try to get real close in so we can actually read it. There we go. So this is the very end of it. It says call to action. It says, you can help South Carolina farmers Hundreds of South Carolina cotton and tobacco farmers who have stubbornly refused to bow to segregation are in immediate need of clothing and funds for medical expenses and school supplies for their children. You can help them. Send money and supplies to NAACP Secretary Mrs. A.W. Simkins, 2025 Marion Street, Columbia, South Carolina. Within 2 or 3 days, hundreds and hundreds of letters arrived, not only at this house, 2025 Marion Street, but also at the National NAACP organization, who had no clue that Simkins was planning to do this. And again, I don't think she had been planning to do it until it happened, right? She had the opportunity, she took it, it happened. And with the help of South Carolina Political Collections, we were able to scan all of these different letters and create this really, really cool wallpaper that people can go up and read all of the different responses they got. People sent $1 if they could, or sometimes a local NAACP chapter would send $10. But then other people couldn't afford that, and they admit that, and they sent clothing, and they sent a few cans of food, and all of that arrived here. And all of Simkins' nieces remember to this day, the ones that are still alive, remember actually dealing with the stuff that arrived and organizing it. And they had to use one of the other buildings Simkins owned to kind of get all the food and everything together to take down to help these individuals. And so we've got all of these different letters, and the quotes that you saw on the other side of the screen are from these letters. But I want to just end, as we began, which is with McKinley Carter's letter. If you can zoom in right there a little bit more. Mrs. Simkins, I am a young man from South Carolina, and I read about the, quote, economic boycotts in Jet magazine. So I am enclosing $5 for the NAACP Relief Fund. I know the battle is a tough one, but if we stick together, we can win. Yours truly, McKinley Carter, Detroit, Michigan. And you'll note that's early October. It's right after that came out in Jet magazine. And again, these letters are from all over the country. So Detroit, Brooklyn, New York, Yuma, Arizona, Los Angeles, California, even places like Oregon and Washington. So Jet magazine had a national platform. And so there was national money coming into South Carolina, even if it was in small amounts. And with that, Simkins and other leaders helped sustain these individuals as they continued to fight to desegregate these schools throughout the 1950s. The flip side of this is that, again, Simkins had not run this idea by the national leadership, and there was some pushback, although ultimately they did support the effort. But within a couple of years, by 1957, Modjeska Simkins is voted out of the South Carolina leadership of the NAACP. But that's okay, because she's forging a new path and moving forward. And by then she had already been thinking about kind of re-upping on this idea of the Richland County Citizens Committee, which she ostensibly first formed in the 1940s, but she really revived in 1956. And so with that, Chandler, if you could head to the next space. And that brings us to our final space, which is Rise Up. So Simkins advocated for a number of progressive causes, in the decades after leaving the NAACP in 1957. So of course in the 1960s, it was desegregating actual institutions in Columbia, especially the lunch counters. But she was also advocating for things like women's rights, the environmental movement, and labor and economic rights, from increasing the minimum wage to expanded labor unions, guaranteeing equal opportunities, expanded Social Security, all of that kind of stuff. So when we moved through, these first two spaces, which are very much about organizing during the Jim Crow period, and then this massive case of resistance that happens with this landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education, of which Briggs v. Elliott was one of 5 cases. The last space, we had to figure out, how can we tie Simkins' legacy and find a through line from all of this work that she has done to the present day? And especially looking at showing how forms of direct protest like sit-ins and strikes were not new ideas to Simkins in the 1960s. So this room doesn't really pick up per se in 1958 or 1960. Sit-ins, strikes, et cetera, these ideas of progress were not new to Simkins in the 1960s. She'd been involved with them for decades by then. So for us to create a through line, we didn't do 1960s to present day. we decided to do these different major organizations and movements going from the 40s to the present day to show people that this stuff, it's not new with what most people think of as the South Carolina or National Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. It's much, much earlier. And so one organization that Simkins was really, really involved with in the 1940s was as an advisor to the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which was a biracial group of men and women who were young, teenagers and college students for the most part. And they came from all walks of life, all socioeconomic levels. They came from inside the country, but there was also international support. And this organization is really popular kind of in the mid to late 1940s. And they're producing literature and they're holding these annual conferences. And so one of the pieces that we were able to find actually, I think there's a copy at Howard University, but this copy is from South Carolina Political Collections. And it's this pamphlet that they produced in 1946, and it's called Radical Truth. And it was really designed to inspire empathy among the white community by kind of putting themselves in their African-American counterparts' shoes. And so as you flip through this pamphlet, it's asking individuals to test yourself. And I don't know if I'll be able to read that, probably not. But it's basically looking at what life was like statistically. If you were a Negro, would you, like the young man on the cover, have a warm and friendly smile? Would you hold fast to your pride in being an American in spite of daily handicaps? Would you be determined to succeed in spite of the obstacles you face because of color? Would you work with your fellow Americans, black and white, to build a better world? Could you smile? And as you flip through the pages, you will read things like, if you were an African American, the chances are 3 times greater that your mother would have died in giving you life. The chances are 50% greater that you would have died when less than a year old. Shocking as this sounds, this is the case even today. And I hope that when people read through this, they think about the statistics, especially with healthcare, but also with economic circumstances for African Americans today. And they say, this is shocking, but it hasn't actually changed much at all since the 1940s. And Chandler, if you'll pan to the right. Thank you. And then and what people will encounter when they first walk in this room is really an overview of the organization that produced that pamphlet, which is, again, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And we really wanted to highlight this institution because Simkins really was a key advisor, even though they weren't based in Columbia. And in that same year that pamphlet was produced, in 1946, they held their annual meeting in Columbia at the Township Auditorium. They had more than 1,000 young people come from across the country to kind of create what was known as a youth congress in a way. You'll notice that the poster there says Southern Youth Legislature. They came together and debated all of the policy ideas that were affecting them. And again, this was a biracial organization. So it was really looking at issues of labor, health, et cetera. And so this kind of section of the exhibit looks at that organization and what they were trying to accomplish. And the little magnetic board, which again, I don't know how well you'll be able to see, was just another opportunity for us, to look in the 1940s at the average white Columbia citizen. What were they reading about this Southern Negro Youth Congress organization and the work that they were doing? So, this youth legislature had really, really major national speakers, including Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, who has long, for decades at that point, been a leader of the national movement for civil rights. And so it's looking at, these different newspaper articles from the state and the headlines and how local white readers might have had their opinions changed about this organization. They didn't view it in the lens that we would view it today, as this very progressive organization that called for, raises to the minimum wage and universal health care and other things like that. They were identifying it as a communistic organization. And that takes place over 3 days as they hear the speeches that were coming out of it. And so it's basically branded communistic, and then within a year or two is completely dismantled. And all of the work that they're doing, fighting for, again, equal wages, more civil rights, it is completely over at that point. So it gives people an opportunity to really use their critical thinking and kind of readership skills. And then the final interactive that we have in this space, if you'll turn to the left, is also part of this reader rail. And again, they met as kind of a Southern Youth Legislature, but their goal was to create and fine-tune policy suggestions that they would send, and that they did send, to the United States Congress. And so it's interesting because of how not just progressive they were for the 1940s, but how progressive they would probably seem today. It truly was ahead of its time. And so we've got this thing where you can read about each one of them, each of the demands they made, and see if progress occurred. So we have passage of an anti-lynching law, an anti-poll tax law. And again, this is 46, 47, 65-cent minimum wage law. They were hoping for passing that. Law establishing national health insurance, law establishing Social Security for workers in domestic, casual, and agricultural employment. And you have to remember the 1940s, a lot of Black Colombians were working at, as housekeepers, as cooks, janitorial positions here in the city. And then passage of a law providing federal aid to education. And so you can flip up each one of these, and I won't ask you to flip up all of them, but Chandler, if you could go to the lynching law and flip that one up. And we purposely made this, the answers to these magnetic so that we can actually remove them if they ever change, not that they will. So you'll notice they were calling, as they had been for quite some time, a passage of an anti-lynching law in 1946, and this was presented to the 1947 United States Congress. Although first introduced in 1918, anti-lynching legislation today remains stalled in Congress. This was true in 2020. It remains true in 2021. We will be sure to change that if it actually ever changes. So we kind of end right there, and Chandler, go ahead and pan up a little bit, because we wanted to tie this in again to the 1960s and beyond, because if Congress could not agree to make lynching a crime, we wanted to examine the idea of what might stop other more sanctioned forms of violence against Black men and women who are protesting through direct action for equal treatment. And so if one half of this space, which we've just gone through, ties the progressive hopes of the 1940s and 30s and 40s with those of today, the next piece, which is foregrounded by these posters, is a film by Mckinley Green, who is a local Black filmmaker, who is tying one of the darkest moments of the 1960s South Carolina civil rights movements, and really one of the darkest moments in our state, to the present Black Lives Matter movement. So now we're tying the 1960s to the present day. And so, and that it normally appears on that screen that's above the fireplace, but what I'm gonna do, we're gonna attempt to show it on my computer because that'll work better, hopefully. All right. So how do I do this, James? Okay, I can't screen share. You have to make me the host. James. Okay, share screen. Sorry, everyone. Give me one sec. Okay, share sound. Share. Oh, sorry, now I gotta open my privacy settings, sorry. Obviously, this is the first time I'm doing this. Sorry, everyone. What is that? Okay, let's try this again. Okay, can everyone see that? Here we go.
Have people know how you feel, your political philosophy, and just the way she thinks, what makes her tick.
I better not tell you everything I think, so. The philosophy that we have had imposed upon us by the white majority through the generations in this country is that we just don't belong. We were taught from slavery and they're still telling us in action, if not in word, that we're not as good as they are.
And are still concerned about some conditions around the killing of Grant Brown by Officer Nates on November the 8th.
anytime you trample on the rights of one person in America, you eventually may trample on the rights of all.
I am in college. I'm sitting here studying. I'm trying to help build this city up, but you keep tearing my people down.
We have high officials here in Columbia who say that they commend the action of the state troopers in the murder. Now, this is something that makes students burn.
It seems clear to us that the state police recklessly disregarded human lives and used excessive force to restrain the student demonstration. How can the governor and the citizens of South Carolina expect Negro youths to have respect for law and order when the very guardians of law and order show such brutality?
Attorneys for the patrolman said the patrolman acted out of self-defense.
So do white Americans face the responsibility
The jury was out for a little over 50 minutes.
of insisting that the law enforcement agencies of our society do in fact protect
They made their decision
all of its citizens
in favor of the patrolman.
instead of doing injury and violence.
We are supposed to respect certain laws that are tabulated, and if we eventually find that those laws are unjust, why then we have a right to go to the courts and fight the laws.
We must demand more from our government officials now.
I'm black, I'm proud, and I'm gonna fight for my people.
I'm not begging you anymore. I've been begging you all these years. I'm not begging anymore. I got the vote now, so I'll see you at the ballot box.
All right, so I hope that y'all were able to hear that. I'm not sure if it was too quiet. But again, that video was produced by Makia Green using footage primarily from Moving Image Research Collection, including Simkins, her voice. You could hear it throughout and see her. And it was really covering and tying together the 1968 Orangeburg Massacre and the present day Black Lives Matter movement. At the very end, you notice that she was talking about voting and having the ballot. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chandler so that we can kind of wrap up the end of this. James, help me out. James, can you switch back to Chandler, please? We got about 4 minutes. Thank you. Okay. You know, so at the very end of that that piece, what Simkins says is, "I'm not begging you anymore. I've got the vote. I'll see you at the ballot box." And that was Simkins being interviewed in the 1970s, still believing this. This is, 3 decades after the end of the all-white Democratic primary. And again, she, as we noted in that very first room, the first fight was for the vote. And when they had the vote beginning in 1948, not just to Republican voting, but also Democratic voting here in the South, from the 1950s through the 1980s, a lot of Simkins' efforts really focused on voter education. I know that we have talked a lot about Briggs v. Elliott and as part of Brown v. Board of Education and other aspects of her work, but she was really, really invested in making sure that people knew what to do when they got to the ballot box, how to get to the ballot box and what to do. And so what we did was we found this voting machine from the 1960s, and it's encased here in this vitrine. And we thought that this would be really instructive for people who have only ever voted, like myself, on digital, machines. And so this is, an example of what you had to do to figure out how you were going to vote for someone. And this is actually, you know, from South Carolina. So Democratic, Republican, all these different candidates. You're supposed to be pulling all kinds of different levers, not quite sure what's going on. So Simkins regularly produced for each election who she and the Richland County Citizens Committee thought you should be voting for, but also what slot they were on this machine, and also exactly how to operate it in very, very simple terms, so that people were really prepared when they got inside that voting booth curtain to know what they're doing. And they don't have to spend time really closely reading these complicated instructions and trying to figure out what it means and if they're doing it right. So that was really, really key to Simkins. And she did that 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the early 80s. So, and Chandler, as you can kind of zoom around and head towards the last panel. So, you know, even at the end of her life, and again, she died in 1992, she really did feel that the ultimate path to power was leveraging the franchise. And, you know, in interviews towards the end of her life, she really relished sharing her opinions. And, you know, we end with this on this matriarch legacies panel, and you'll see her there. She's at a bus boycott. You know, she had some fiery opinions. And, you know, we end with the idea of how change can be brought about. And the only way she felt it could be was through the ballot, but also the effective teaching of people about what individual politicians actually stood for and what they were going to do. You know, so she was really, you know, invested in sharing her opinions, you know, but she also was really, really invested in these interviews in the 70s and 80s in talking about the barriers that had been erected against her and against many, many others throughout, you know, the century. And she turned those barriers as part of the power structure, right? The people in power who were making decisions. And she also left us with a really clear roadmap of the successes of the long civil rights movement in South Carolina, but also some of the failures that they had. You know, and what is a decades long struggle for equality. And so, you know, at the end, there's a call to action panel, and, you know, it's really up to us to take, you know, these lessons that she has shared and decide what action we're going to take, right? This exhibit is full of actions that Simkins has taken. And she once said, "I just like a fight. I don't feel good when I'm not in a fight." And so we leave people with a question: will you join her? And in what way might you continue her legacy? So that takes you through the three spaces. I know we're at 1 o'clock, but Chandler, if you could just zoom out and kind of walk people through. And again, there's a call to action panel, but we won't focus on it. It's down there in the corner. But then as people, and he's spinning around, as people leave this space, the students that come to this site are invited into 2 different meeting and maker spaces. We included, and Chandler actually did this, we have original wallpaper from this house. We have several samples. We took the best one and Chandler recreated it. So that's reproduction wallpaper from this space that's on that wall, along with the Richard Samuel Roberts portrait of Modjeska Simkins. And a lot of books. We've purchased a couple of hundred of different books by Black authors, past and present, for use by high school and college students that come to work with our education staff in this space. We have all new furniture, both here and in a room that I think is locked, so Chandler probably can't get in there right now, along with a smart board, button makers, new Macs for creating different things. Because what you'll notice above the windows in this space, you'll see that there are little metal tracks that run across the room. So the idea is that students will come and experience Mrs. Simkins' life, and then they will come in here and do activities with our education staff and with their teachers. And among those activities is thinking about how Simkins was able to create all this stuff to get out the word throughout her life, and thinking about what they want to create. And so the other space is a maker space. So if they want to create buttons, if they want to create a protest poster, they have options to do all of that. And then some of it will remain in the house and hang on those metal tracks so that future visitors can come and experience that and kind of get inspiration from that. So with that said, we are not really open to visitors at this point because of the COVID crisis that's ongoing, and we're maintaining really, really strict protocols. With that said, there are a couple of ways that we're making this site accessible. The first is a partnership with South Carolina ETV. They have already filmed 360-degree shots of all of these exhibit spaces, and they also have access to all of the high-res panels. And so that should either come out later this week or next week. So if you signed up for this, you'll be sent a link and we'll be sharing it on our social media. And basically you'll be able to see all of the stuff I just showed you, but you'll be able to click through it on your own and actually read some of the panels, especially because I know it was hard to read any of it today with the internet connection. So that's one way we're sharing. And then the second way is that, if anyone, especially members of Historic Columbia, want to come tour the site privately, Robin and I are open to that. So you can either email me at kallen@historiccolumbia.com or .org, or you can email our executive director, Robin Waits, and we'll find a way to get you into the site. I don't know, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, which I'd be happy to answer, or you can just email me. But evidently, James just made me the host. I'm not sure, he might have just left. So if we have any questions, gotta go, then please let me know. But if not, we'll go ahead and sign off. Okay, well, I appreciate all of you coming and kind of bopping through this thing with me. It's so tough for us that we can't have a big opening ceremony, ribbon cutting, but we do plan to do one once we're in a new normal. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. And again, for the online virtual tour. And email me if you have any questions. And thank you all for joining. And did she work with MLK? Work with is perhaps a little strong. Did she know Martin Luther King Jr.? Absolutely. He visited Motel Simbeth. She corresponded with him somewhat through his SCLC organization. Yeah, she was definitely a fan of his work. And again, his work wasn't just, desegregation. He was also very, very interested in, of course, the poverty. And again, like Simkins was very, very interested in the franchise, but she was also equally invested in raising everyone up. When she was growing up on this farm outside of Columbia, her family, despite being African-American and having disadvantages, they were a lot better off than a lot of their neighbors, and most of whom were white. And she recognized that. And she recognized that there had to be ways to raise everyone up. And she was invested in that, absolutely. All right. Again, thank y'all. You feel free to email me if you have questions. If you want to come visit the site, we absolutely welcome you. It's ready to go. It's got all the interactives, so I appreciate it. I think we're going to sign off. Thank you all.